The video will examine the extreme measures used by 3 individuals in order to escape from terrifying and impossible circumstances. Viewers are cautioned to use their own judgment. For Thanksgiving 2022, the Grimes family was looking for a change of pace. It was also not simple to gather all 18 members of their large family around a single dining table. The couple had spotted a 5-day Thanksgiving cruise that year across the Gulf of Mexico to the little Mexican island of Cozumel, and thought it would be a wonderful way to spend the holidays. For once, they could all come together to celebrate, enjoy themselves, and not have to cook. They boarded a cruise the day before Thanksgiving, set sail, and wasted no time getting into the entertainment, including performances, music, dancing, and cocktails. James Michael Grimes, a member of the family, learned about an air guitar tournament that was going to be held later that night. To make a long story short, air guitar was James's party trick. He couldn't bear to give up the free drink that was the reward. Consequently, when his moment came, he performed an energetic and stylish air solo that left an impression on the judges. He received the complimentary drink as a result, and he continued the celebration with his family. Around 11 o'clock that evening, he felt the urge to use the restroom, so he informed his sister of his whereabouts and made his way to the deck's adjacent washroom. He was never able to reach the restroom, unfortunately. Rather, James lost consciousness and went overboard somewhere between leaving the boat and opening the door to the restroom. He regained consciousness a little time later when at sea, the ship out of sight. I can only imagine how terrible those initial moments upon awakening were. In addition to the complete absence of land and light, he has sufficient mental faculties to hazardously recall the ship's course and was aware that he was swimming much too deep into the Gulf of Mexico to reach shore. With no light to guide him, he had no choice but to swim in the dark, praying that someone would see him gone. James, astonishingly, was hell-bent on making it through the ordeal alive. Keeping swimming was the first order of business. For fear of what may happen if he stopped, he repeatedly reassured himself that he must not drown. That was easier said than done at times. He would be floating serenely on the ocean 1 second, and then dragged under the waves the next by a rip current. Fortunately, James had experience with long hours of heavy labor as a construction worker. If he hadn't been in such good shape, he may have been pulled under. In addition, he kept his composure by reminding himself to take deep breaths whenever he felt anxious. And he recalled reading that freaking out was the worst thing to do while stranded at sea. The minutes passed into hours, and he occupied himself with matters that would ensure his survival. As he wished he could see his 9-year-old daughter again, he composed songs and sung them aloud. He had been floating for a few hours when he felt an abrupt, severe ache in his thigh. Then another, and another, until he looked down and saw that he had sunk into a swarm of jellyfish, which were relentlessly stinging him. As he swam through them, James had to gather all his might, since each sting hurt so much. He eventually cleared out, but it wasn't completely secure just yet. After that, he saw a fin 15 feet distant, and he realized that the sharks in the Gulf of Mexico were legendary. At first, he wasn't certain it was a shark. However, when he lowered his head to examine it more closely, he could see its large size and the distinctive features of its long, flat jaw. And then, before he knew it, the beast was riding shotgun, ramming into his leg. In an attempt to frighten it away, he swung his leg around violently and yelled out loud. Either the shark wasn't real, or it wasn't interested in him. Regardless, he let out a sigh of relief when it flipped and swam away. On Thanksgiving Day, as the sun was coming up, James felt his hunger and thirst intensify. Upon beginning to survey the area for potential edible or drinkable items, he discovered that there was just salt water. Then, something in the water caught his eye just ahead. Reaching out, he grabbed what seemed like a bit of bamboo or wood, but he chewed on it nevertheless. Despite its likely lack of nutritional value, it gave him the satisfaction of eating something, and it tasted okay. Following that, he persisted in floating, pondering the arrival of help. His sister's anxiety the night before had grown rapidly. She worried that he got entangled in one of the other boat parties when he didn't return from the restroom. However, they were cabin mates, and she chose to inform the cruise ship staff when he didn't come back that night. Returning to its route from the previous night, the cruise ship wasted no time in launching a search and rescue mission. In addition, they got in touch with emergency services, who alerted other nearby boats to the fact that someone had gone overboard and asked them to assist in the search. They wouldn't locate him until the night after the next. James saw a tanker out in the distance around 8:25 on Thanksgiving night. He was shivering in the chilly water and sunburned from the scorching heat by that point. Not only was he sunburned and very weak, but he also knew he had to keep swimming. At last, when he approached one of the ships, an eye caught sight of him. They signaled for assistance to their other crew members and proceeded to attach a flashlight to a life preserver, which they hurled as near to him as they could. Unfortunately, James was obviously losing strength as the waves pushed it back each time he attempted to approach it. When he failed many times, a fellow boater shouted that the Coast Guard was approaching and that he should continue to tread water. Helicopter service would be available in only 15 more minutes. The illumination it cast on the water failed to hit James, prompting him to remove his socks, slacks, and boxers, which he then brandished over his head. He believed he heard a Coast Guardsman yell, "Gotcha!" as they winched themselves down into the water by his side as the spotlight finally settled on him. James, who had lost all strength, just slumped into the rescue sling that the Coast Guard had slung around him. He could have been about to drown for all of a few seconds. James insists he wasn't intoxicated, doesn't know what caused him to pass out, and still doesn't know how he got into the water. He was then evacuated to the hospital to be treated for hypothermia. It seems like he is eager to go on another cruise despite the trauma, but he is pledged to remain at least 10 feet away from the guardrails. In case you've ever wanted to know what life is like in the South Pole, you can really make the journey there. Between 50 and 200 individuals, including researchers, engineers, operations, and support personnel, live and work at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station at any one moment. During the summer, a small number of visitors also fly in to see the untamed beauty of what is perhaps the most isolated spot on the planet. Taking a specially adapted plane out of New Zealand or Chile is your best bet for getting to and from the location. Summertime, from November through February, is when these flights operate, weather permitting. On days when the weather is nice, tourists can only spend a few hours there before taking a plane back. Staff members that operate the station endure the worst summer and winter weather conditions for a whole year, often on a one-year contract. Antarctic winters are notoriously frigid, but they also have one very long night, or 6 months of almost non-existent light. Winter flying is very risky because of the low light levels and extremely low temperatures. Hence, it is the responsibility of the overwinter personnel to resolve any issues that may arise. There is, as you can expect, an abundance of injuries while living in such a distant and difficult place. But with such a small population and staff members who are instructed to use extreme caution, they seldom need more than one medic on call. During the 1998 to 1999 season, Dr. Jerry Nielsen served as the station's medical officer, a role typically held by a tough and seasoned physician. Jerry had a wealth of experience, much like the previous physicians who had worked at the station before her. She became well known as a top-notch emergency department physician after working at many hospitals after graduating from Ohio's Medical College. Afterwards, she needed a change of environment and a place to retreat to in order to overcome the agony of her divorce. There couldn't have been a more thrilling location for a fresh start than the South Pole Research Station, where she noticed an advertisement for a medical officer. Even more so, she would say that Antarctica is like a blank slate, a place where your soul may be written. Summer on the ice was quite uneventful after arrival. She endured a few setbacks, including an illness and an accident. But in February 1999, she saw the final jet take off until November and got ready for the next long winter. Jerry felt it was critical to examine her health before examining anybody else as part of this preparedness. She was aware that there were others on base who were trained in first aid, but she also understood that there would be a major issue, particularly during winter, if she were ever too ill to do her duties. During a self-examination that Jerry conducted around 1 month after the previous flight, she discovered a little bump in her breast. Whatever it was, she was certain it wasn't there when she checked before. Even though the station's medical facility had all the necessary equipment, she was unable to have a non-invasive test like a mammogram, so she had to find out what it was. If she could reach the area, one of the scientists at the station may be able to determine what the lump was, but no one there had any experience with such procedures. When it came to that particular operation, not even Jerry had much expertise. Her background was in emergency services, which was ideal for the Antarctic station. For the most part, but not in this particular situation. After extensive deliberations, she decided to approach her American colleagues for help via email and teleconference. Unfortunately, they could only come up with one answer. Whether or not she had experience, Jerry was the only one on site who could do that kind of operation. A self-biopsy would be required of her. As a result, she rounded up a few other people with medical training and started experimenting with raw chicken, removing cells from within using a hypodermic needle. She inserted it into one of the needles and filled it with lidocaine, a tranquilizer. As the medical staff monitored her vitals, she repeatedly inserted the needle into her right breast, pumping a little amount of anesthetic to numb the area around the lump. Afterwards, she retrieved the second needle and syringe and proceeded to insert it into the tumor, penetrating its connective tissue and skin until she could feel its resistance. She proceeded to puncture the mass and retract the plunger in order to retrieve maximum material, which was then submitted for analysis. The most discouraging news she could have received was that the sample was inconclusive when it came back from the lab. She reached out to the United States once again for more assistance and a fresh strategy since their outdated technology could not determine whether she had cancer or not. The idea came to them quickly, but they were aware of the extreme dangers of landing an aircraft at that time of year. But emergency drops were nothing new for them. A pilot could still reach the South Pole by following the circle of flames that the station workers had lighted outside, even if it was too cold and dark to land. They used parachutes to lower the goods once they're seen. A U.S. military plane departed from Christchurch, New Zealand on July 11th, carrying upgraded diagnostic tools, medical supplies, and chemotherapy medications, among other things. It was determined that she really required the medicine after the recovery of the cargo and a subsequent testing. It would be months before Jerry could get to a hospital, since she had a severe type of breast cancer. Right after, the United States authorities began planning her early return, but they could only guarantee her a return to the country in early October at the earliest. Meanwhile, Jerry went back to her little medical team and instructed them on how to give chemotherapy so she could start treatment as she waited to take off. Through thick and thin, Jerry kept working, tending to patients' hip injuries and writing antibiotic prescriptions right up until the rescue aircraft touched down. At last, on October 15th, when the weather improved, the scientist with the hip injury and Jerry were airlifted out of the station. Multiple operations, including a mastectomy, were part of her treatment regimen after she got back to the United States. During the 10 years that her disease was in remission, Jerry gave lectures on her experience all over the globe, including at the Antarctic station, and wrote a book about it. She had a devastating recurrence of cancer in 2005, which eventually spread throughout her body. She died on June 24, 2009. The Australian town of Mount Nebo is located around 11 miles west of Brisbane. With a population of a little more than 400, the area's sparsely scattered structures are almost unnoticeable when seen on a map. In contrast, the woodlands that encircle it stretch for more than 40 miles in length and 12 miles in width, following the outlines of the Diaghilar mountain range that borders agricultural areas and other towns in Brisbane's northernmost suburbs. Neil Parker, a 54-year-old regular hiker, decided to take in the verdant scenery on September 15, 2019. With extensive expertise as a guide and a founding member of the local bushwalker organization, he had traversed this trail many times. Beyond that, he had been a part of the Australian State Emergency Service for quite some time, which is a network of support organizations that deals with a wide range of emergencies such as floods, earthquakes, car accidents, marine rescue, and search and rescue by helicopter. To say that Neil was well prepared is an understatement. If it weren't for a random turn of events, he would have been the one rushing to save the day. An hour and 40 minutes into the whole hike along Neil's path, there was a little waterfall along Cabbage Tree Creek, falling down a shale cliff, about 40 minutes off the final main trail. This shale-covered cliff, which resembles a ladder or a series of shelves, was a frequent feature of Neil's journey. Ascending once more, he slipped his walking poles into his backpack and was about to enjoy the breathtaking view from the peak when he felt a movement under his fingers. In the spring of Australia, the lichen that had been growing on the rocks started to dry up, and its roots had become weaker. In a state of panic, Neil frantically extended his hand to grasp another ledge. For a split second he succeeded, but his upward momentum tore the stone from his grasp, and he plummeted from a height of 6 meters, or 20 feet. At the base of the falls, he landed in around 1 meter of water, after slamming onto another ledge on his left side and spinning around on his back. Fortunately, Neil wasn't in imminent danger of drowning, since neither Mount Nebo nor its streams are very enormous. However, he became aware of his dire condition as the moment slipped away and he rested on the creek bank. At the base of the falls, he landed in around 1 meter of water after slamming onto another ledge on his left side and spinning around on his back. Fortunately, Neil wasn't in imminent danger of drowning since neither Mount Nebo nor its streams are very enormous. However, he became aware of his dire condition as the moment slipped away and he rested on the creek bank. He was in dire need of assistance, but the mountain valley had rendered his phone service completely useless. Even worse, he only had one hand to return the phone to his pocket before it fell out and ended up in the stream. On top of everything else, Neil knew from his background as a rescuer and hiker that no one would be able to locate him there, even if they were aware of his disappearance. And nobody had any idea he had gone missing until that very second. Perhaps he had become a little too comfortable, or perhaps he had gone trekking here so often that he didn't want to annoy others by telling them the same thing again and again. In any case, nobody had any idea he was there that day. To rub salt in the wound, he had left his emergency beacon at his ex-wife's home when they were separated, which would have quickly gotten him rescued. Mount Nebo is quite different from the expansive savanna that most people picture when they think of Australia. Since of the thick forest cover, it is frequently impossible to see the designated pathways and streams since they are hidden behind the trees. Having been on rescue teams before, he was aware of how difficult it would be for them to locate him in his current location. The only way for Neil to be discovered was for him to do it himself. Walking would not be an option for him. In light of this information and the fact that he had no more opportunities to waste time or money, he retrieved his first aid supplies, made a splint out of his walking sticks, and fixed his broken ankle by himself. After that, he slung his left arm over it and secured it with bandages. He hoped the broken bones hadn't caused any major internal hemorrhage. But even under ideal conditions, the procedure would have been excruciating. With just one functioning hand and some over-the-counter medicines, Neil was compelled to do it. Nearby, on the path where he knew several residents enjoyed jogging for fitness, was his best bet for being located. This spot was about 2 miles distant. Neil hoped someone would be there, but he would have to face his greatest personal struggle to get there. But cleverly, Neil hogtied the left side of his body by tying a length of bandage to his broken leg and attaching it to the still-functioning elbow of his broken arm. This allowed him to drag his arm forward and elevate his foot off the ground. That way, he could avoid injuring his fractured foot even more by dragging it down the floor. But it also meant he had to raise and carry his leg weight every time he crawled. To give you an idea of how bad the math is, considering the uneven terrain, Neil could probably pull himself up by 2 to 4 inches, or 5 to 10 centimeters, using just his right arm and leg. That comes to almost 40,000 repeats on average. Keep in mind that Neil would have to endure unbearable discomfort as he continuously had to circumvent obstacles, climb and descend slopes, and so on, all while following the basic rule that every stride on tough terrain requires 2 steps. He must have done at least 84,000 repetitions, if not more, as his strength gradually diminished and his growth slowed down, all while surviving on the little supplies of food and water brought along for a brief 3-hour trek. He had to pause and collect his breath every 1 to 1.5 meters, or every 3.5 feet, since this became so taxing on his body. Kneeling down the slope gradually, following the creek's edge, leaving Sunday behind, and entering Monday, it became quite evident that they would have a hard time finding him where he was the first evening when he saw a rescue helicopter pass above. He was so tired that Neil spent the night curled up beneath his emergency thermal blanket, rationing the little food he had, a handful of almonds, a trail bar, and some candy, because he had carried very little with him. At long last, a barrage of phone calls started on Monday morning when Neil did not show up for work. His boss contacted Neil's ex-wife, who in turn contacted other relatives and acquaintances of Neil's, including his sisters and friends, completely unknown to everybody. However, Neil's adventure was far from over. He devoted all of Monday to slithering down the mountain. What he might have walked in a matter of minutes before now takes hours to do. A constant motivation for Neil as he pushed himself was the notion of his kid. They hadn't exchanged words in years, and he wasn't prepared to let that stand. There was no way for Neil to just sit on a hillside and let things happen. He had to put things right. Concerned about Neil's whereabouts, a friend of his got a worried phone call on Monday afternoon. In response, the buddy recalled that Neil had mentioned going on a trek earlier in the week. When word got out about his whereabouts, Neil's family and his own bushwalker group were quick to respond. A large number of his friends and other hikers embarked on a search mission after hearing about him from his co-workers in the emergency services. In the hopes that someone might see him this time, Neil slept in the open that night after locating a clearing farther down the stream. After 2 days of hard work, he woke up in agony, hungry and exhausted. He lay there for a while, trying to recuperate. Fortunately, a helicopter's rotors began to spin about 10:30 in the morning. In a state of shock, Neil sprang into action once more, this time making an effort to be visible by grabbing the reflective foil blanket and waving it with his right arm. Eventually, as the aircraft drew near, Neil recognized it as a Queensland government air rescue chopper. A rescue worker rappelled down to visit him a few moments after that. After doing their best to stabilize Neil's injuries, they placed him in a rescue basket. By day's end, he had been reunited with loved ones, was in high spirits when speaking to media at a Brisbane hospital, and had been hospitalized. Although he is naturally adventurous, he has said that he probably won't return to extreme activities, even if he intends to resume trekking.